Julia Flynn tightened the straps of her worn tote bag as she stepped off the bus, the city's early morning bustle swirling around her like a tide she barely knew how to navigate. Her janitor uniform, faded and patched in places, marked her plainly against the polished glass buildings that reflected the rising sun. Today was different. Today, she would enter not as a worker scrubbing floors but as someone chasing a small, hard-earned dream. She had saved for months, setting aside spare change from extra shifts and skipped lunches, all for this, a pottery class at the renowned clay and canvas studio, a place she'd watched longingly from across the street during her breaks. The storefront shone with sleek marble and delicate ceramic pieces illuminated under pristine spotlights. The faint scent of sandalwood incense drifted through the open door, tangling with the rush of fresh clay and glaze. Julia took a breath, the unfamiliar luxury making her heart race. At the reception desk, a young woman in a crisp designer blouse glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly at Julia's thrifted jacket and plastic shopping bag. Summoning all her courage, Julia managed to ask, "Hi, I'm here for the pottery class I booked." "It's, at 10? I think it's pottery." Her voice wavered, the words stumbling out as pot, tree. The receptionist's smile twisted into a smirk. "Pottery, huh? Sorry, the class is full. Maybe next time for people who actually know how to say it properly." Her words, loud and sharp, cut through the softly murmuring crowd gathered in the studio lobby. Heads turned. Whispered giggles sparked nearby. The weight of invisible eyes pressed down on Julia as the sting of humiliation bloomed cold and unforgiving. She stood still, small and unwelcome, the luxurious world just beyond reach. Julia stepped back from the reception desk, feeling her cheeks burn with shame as the receptionist's laughter mingled with the quiet whispers and half-hidden smirks around her. Some of the people waiting for the class clutched their designer bags tighter, exchanging looks that said clearly, "She shouldn't be here." A few glanced away, their eyes flickering with discomfort but holding their silence. A young woman seated nearby frowned deeply, but she said nothing. Julia's breath caught, and she fought the urge to cry. Without a word, she turned and left the bright, warm lobby, stepping into the chill of the morning street. The steady hum of the city felt suddenly distant, as if she'd been exiled from some vibrant world she hoped to enter but had been barred from. The plastic tote bag she carried felt heavier than ever, the worn straps digging into her shoulder. She walked a few steps before sinking onto a cold stone bench tucked away just around the corner from the studio. The bench was rough and unwelcoming, but it was shelter from the gaze of curious onlookers. Julia pulled her legs close, clutching the bag to her chest as a wave of exhaustion and heartbreak swept over her. Her fingers trembled, and she closed her eyes to hold back the tears. Memories surfaced abruptly, unbidden and sharp. She remembered the long months of scrimping and saving, how she declined invitations for drinks with coworkers or extra meals to put a little more money in her dream jar. How she worked extra cleaning shifts evenings and weekends so she could afford this one special experience. Her body still ached from the hours spent bent over mopping every floor, scrubbing bathrooms, wiping down countertops. Not glamorous work, but the kind that kept the towering glass buildings gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Julia thought of her mother, who had passed away the previous year after a long illness. They'd always shared the dream that Julia would find beauty in the world beyond practicalities. Her mother's final words had been a soft whisper of encouragement. "Find what makes you happy, Julia. Don't let the world's noise drown your own voice." The pottery class was supposed to be Julia's way of opening a new chapter. She had envisioned shaping clay with her hands, feeling the malleability of creation beneath her fingertips rather than just the harsh, impervious surfaces she cleaned day after day. To her, the studio represented possibility, something more than a life defined by uniforms and mops. Now, sitting alone on the bench, replaying the scene again and again, Julia felt the heavy weight of rejection settle over her like a stone. It wasn't just being turned away from a class, it was the sneer, the implication that she didn't belong, that her simple life made her unworthy of something beautiful and artistic. The laughter behind her ears echoed relentlessly. Yet beneath the pain, a small ember of defiance flickered. Julia recalled the quiet resilience that had carried her through nights when she worried about bills, about doing enough, about not letting despair take root. She remembered the satisfaction of finishing a cleaning shift spotless, the glimmer of pride in doing a job well even when no one noticed. Her endurance was ordinary to some, but to her, it was strength. Glancing down at her hands, rough and calloused from hard work, Julia felt an unfamiliar swelling of determination. She might be simple, she might be overlooked, but she was not invisible. Not entirely. Swallowing hard, she rose from the bench, dusted off her thrift jacket, and adjusted the strap of her tote bag. The cold was fresher now, stinging her cheeks and snapping her out of the fog of sadness. She began walking, her pace slow but steady, blending into the river of city commuters heading to their own destinations. As she passed a flower vendor on the street corner, the burst of bright colors and faint sweetness of fresh blooms caught her attention. Without hesitation, Julia bought a single white daisy, feeling its delicate petals beneath her fingers, simple and resilient. Holding the flower tightly, she breathed in deep, allowing the small symbol of hope and renewal to prick at the corners of her heart. Later, on the bus heading back to her neighborhood, the noise and faces seemed different. Julia watched reflections in the windows, the city light bouncing off glass facades, and she asked herself how she could turn this day, cruel and humiliating as it had been, into something more. Something that wasn't just about pain, but about standing up for a basic truth: dignity belongs to everyone. The pottery class was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to find joy beyond her work and loss. The rejection stung sharply, but it had also revealed something else, a gnawing urge to push back, however quietly. When she got home that evening, Julia sat at her small kitchen table, the daisy balanced in a jar of water she had quickly filled earlier. The window was cracked open a little, letting in the cool night air and the distant sounds of the city, a reminder that the world went on, indifferent yet full of possibility. In those moments, Julia promised herself she wouldn't let today define her. The ache of being dismissed in a moment of hope was deep, but so was the stubborn flame inside her. For all the silent sacrifices and overlooked labor, for the dreams she held close in the quiet corners of her life, she would find a way to keep moving forward. Slowly, carefully, Julia traced the outline of the daisy's slender stem, willing herself to believe that even in a city of glass and marble, raw, simple beauty could still take root. The next morning, a gray sky hung low over the city, spilling a quiet drizzle onto the streets. Julia woke with a heavy yet determined heart. The sting from her experience at the studio was still fresh beneath her skin, but she wasn't going to let it unravel her entirely. After her morning routine, a quick breakfast of toast and tea, she pulled on her faded jacket and stepped out into the damp air, heading toward the bus stop for her routine janitorial shift. As she passed the morning rush crowd, her thoughts churned. The unexpected scar from the previous day lingered, but an idea had started to take shape in her mind. She might not be able to join that class today, but perhaps she could push for something better, not just for herself but for anyone else who felt unwelcome in places meant to inspire. Her route home from the studio passed near a side entrance of the clay and canvas art studio, a narrow alley she'd barely noticed before. Curious and restless, she decided to take a detour there, hoping to clear her head. The alley was quiet, the faint scent of clay and wood smoke blending with the crisp air. As she neared the back door of the studio, she heard voices, a soft murmur rising from an open window above. Julia paused, drawn toward the sound. Crouched near the door, she listened carefully. Inside, a conversation between two staff members unfolded. One voice was familiar, the tone casual but tinged with frustration. "Look, we still haven't done any official health inspections this quarter," the voice said. "The city hasn't come around, and honestly, the bosses don't care as long as the classes run and the cash flows." Julia's breath hitched. An unchecked health inspection? She thought about the neat rows of pottery wheels, the spotless counters, but also the cramped storage rooms she'd glimpsed briefly. What if there were hazards hidden beneath all that polish? The implications felt dangerous. The other voice shrugged. "Better not say anything too loud. No one wants trouble. It's just running things on the fly, you know." Julia swallowed hard. Her disbelief at the carelessness settled beside her own recent experience of exclusion. Here was a place that not only dismissed people outright but also shirked responsibilities to keep its customers safe. Without thinking much beyond the impulse to act, Julia pulled out her phone and recorded a short clip out of sight, a quick video of the narrow alley, the sign above the side door, and her whisper recounting, "They admitted they haven't had safety inspections in months. This is dangerous." She then wrote a careful email to a local arts and culture reporter she had followed on social media for years. She explained in a clear, concise message what she'd experienced at the front desk and the conversation she'd overheard out back. She attached the video, unpolished and raw but authentic. Julia hesitated a moment, heart pounding, then hit send. The act felt both daring and terrifying. She wasn't sure what would come of it, or if anyone would even pay attention, but she knew she couldn't remain silent about something so deeply wrong. Heading back toward the bus stop, Julia felt the drizzle pick up, cool drops striking her jacket. The city was waking up in earnest now. People scurried past, faces buried in umbrellas, rushing toward jobs, meetings, errands. She blended easily among them, but there was a new spring in her step, subtle but undeniable. Later that evening, Julia sat in her tiny apartment, the dull hum of the city outside her window blending with the soft light of a single lamp. She waited anxiously, refreshing her email inbox on her small phone again and again. Minutes passed into hours, and just when she was ready to give up hope, a reply arrived. The local reporter, Mara Solis, wrote back warmly and with interest, thanking Julia for her courage and honesty. Mara explained that the story was important, that many people had written about elite cultural spaces but few voices came from those often excluded. She promised to look into the health inspection issue and the treatment Julia endured at the studio. Julia felt a surge of relief, followed by a complex weave of fear and pride. The ripples she'd begun throwing into a still pond might reach places she couldn't yet see. Over the next few days, Julia's phone buzzed more often. Messages poured in, not all supportive, but far more encouraging than she expected. Some people shared similar stories of being dismissed by places that claimed to celebrate art and creativity but only catered to a narrow, privileged crowd. Others offered resources, suggested community classes, or simply thanked her for speaking up. Amid it all, Julia kept working her janitorial shifts, polishing floors and wiping counters with a quiet smile she didn't entirely understand. The sting of rejection was still there, but mixed with new hope, the knowledge that by speaking out, she was no longer invisible. When Julia passed her old bus stop that week, she noticed a small flyer attached to a nearby pole advertising free pottery workshops at a different community center. Something inside her stirred at the thought of trying again, this time somewhere that embraced people like her. One afternoon, on her way home, Julia stopped briefly at a local art supply shop she'd never visited before. The small bell jingled as she stepped inside, the scent of paint and canvas familiar and comforting. The owner, a kind woman named Anne, greeted her with a warm smile. They chatted briefly, and then offered Julia a few clay sample packs on the house, saying, "Everyone deserves a space to create." Julia left the shop clutching the soft clay, the texture oddly soothing in her hands. The small rounds of possibility felt heavier than any plastic tote bag she'd carried. That night, sitting alone with a lump of clay on her table, Julia let her fingers press and shape with quiet determination. The circulation of pain and hope pulsed beneath her skin, guiding her hands as she formed soft curves and uneven shapes. It wasn't the studio's polished workshops or the elite art scene, but it was hers, real, tactile, and precious. In the days ahead, word of Julia's email and the reporter's interest grew quietly. The city's arts community buzzed with chatter behind the scenes. Julia, sitting at her modest kitchen table with that small lump of clay, steeled herself for whatever would come, and felt, for the first time in a long while, as if she might just be part of something bigger than the solitary struggle she'd known. The story's ripple became a swell. Within days of the local reporter Mara Solis publishing her piece, Julia Flynn's experience at Clay and Canvas and the revelation about the studio's neglected health inspections ignited a firestorm across social media platforms. The video Julia had recorded, raw and unfiltered, went viral on TikTok almost overnight. It racked up tens of thousands of views, with viewers sharing and commenting relentlessly. The first wave of reactions was a mixture of outrage and disbelief. How can a place so prestigious treat people with such blatant disrespect? One comment read. Others spoke directly to Julia. Your courage is inspiring, and thank you for standing up when so many of us have been silenced. The video showed Julia nervously at the reception desk, the sneer of the staff member, the shifting eyes of the other patrons. Then the audio cut to Julia's whispered message about the ignored health inspections, painting a picture of a studio that prioritized image and profit over safety and respect. A floodgate opened as people from all walks of life began sharing their own experiences of exclusion from elite artistic venues. A young street artist posted about being denied entry to a gallery event because of his casual clothes. A retired schoolteacher shared how she had been passed over for community art programs due to age biases. Working parents recounted being turned away from expensive classes that supposedly welcomed families. Many tagged Julia's video and Mara's article, creating an online chorus demanding accountability. Under mounting pressure, Clay and Canvas issued a public announcement. The statement was carefully worded, acknowledging the unfortunate incident involving a visitor and apologizing for any offense caused. The studio revealed a temporary closure of its doors while it conducted an internal review. The message promised immediate steps to ensure all guests feel welcome and safe, a phrase that felt hollow to some but was a start. Behind the scenes, city health inspectors arrived to conduct a thorough inspection at the studio. Their findings substantiated Julia's concerns: outdated sanitation equipment, improperly stored materials that posed a risk to visitors with allergies, and incomplete records for recent health and safety checks. The studio faced fines and was ordered to address the violations before reopening. The image of the pristine studio now tarnished spread quickly across news segments and community blogs. The receptionist who had humiliated Julia was placed on administrative leave pending review. Internal sources leaked that several staff members were undergoing sensitivity and inclusivity training. Some employees who had feared speaking out found encouragement and safe ways to raise concerns. Julia's life shifted unexpectedly. Messages arrived from unexpected places, from local artists offering free workshops, community centers inviting her to share her story, and even leaders of inclusivity initiatives in the city's art scene expressing solidarity. In her own community, neighbors stopped her at the market, praising her bravery and telling her their own stories of feeling invisible. Her quiet perseverance had sparked a movement much larger than she could have imagined. Other workers in service jobs began posting their experiences, often thanking Julia for opening a door for them. Their voices, previously muted by economic hardship or social invisibility, found a platform and a growing audience. Julia saw in their stories the same stings of exclusion she had felt and recognized the power in collective awareness. Mara Solis continued to cover the aftermath, her articles blending Julia's journey with the broader issue of equitable access to cultural spaces. She highlighted community programs that emphasized diversity and inclusion, spotlighting grassroots efforts that contrasted sharply with exclusive establishments like the studio. For Julia, the swelling wave of public support fueled a quiet transformation. She continued with her janitorial job, the physical labor unchanged but the way she carried herself shifting subtly. The subtle nods of recognition from familiar faces at work, the occasional warm smile that felt more genuine than usual, these small moments knitted a sense of belonging. Though the studio's apology remained formal and distant, Julia noticed a tangible difference in conversations around her. The idea that art was solely for the privileged elite was being challenged, and the barriers Julia once faced felt less insurmountable. Her own sense of dignity, once so fragile, grew stronger each day. One afternoon, the local community center reached out to invite Julia to speak at a gathering discussing inclusion in the arts. The event was modest, a small room filled with people of varied backgrounds, many standing along the walls to listen. Julia's voice trembled at first, but as she recounted her story, the room fell silent. Her words, simple and unvarnished, carried the weight of lived experience. The gathering sparked new partnerships. Local artists offered discounted classes, community organizations made pottery and creative workshops more accessible, and a small fund was created to support low-income individuals seeking artistic experiences. Julia's single step had blossomed into a garden of change. Meanwhile, Clay and Canvas announced that upon reopening, it would implement new inclusivity measures, sliding scale fees, staff inclusivity trainings, and community outreach initiatives. A large banner outside the studio proclaimed, "Our doors are open to all," a promise Julia regarded cautiously but with hope. Through it all, Julia maintained her groundedness. She didn't seek the spotlight, she didn't ask for accolades. Her satisfaction came from knowing her voice had been heard, that she had helped open conversations that many had avoided for too long. One evening, as she relaxed on a worn couch in her modest apartment, Julia scrolled through her messages again. There was a thread from Mara Solis, filled with supportive notes and invitations to upcoming events, and another from Anne, the thoughtful art supply shop owner, offering clay and tools whenever Julia was ready. Julia held her phone close, a small smile playing on her lips. The path before her was still unfolding, filled with uncertainties, but also new opportunities. She had stepped out of the shadows of invisibility and reclaimed a place where her aspirations, once dismissed, could finally take shape. Her journey was far from over. Yet what mattered most was that she had sparked something bigger than herself, a quiet revolution in a world that too often overlooked those who dared to dream simply. Several weeks had passed since the story about Julia Flynn's experience at Clay and Canvas swept through the city's conversations and online platforms. The intense spotlight had dimmed somewhat, replaced by steady talks about inclusion and creativity that continued behind closed doors and in community centers. Julia knew her life would never be the same, not because of grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but because something fundamental within her had shifted. On a cool spring morning, Julia stood in front of the studio once more, not as an outsider, but as someone who had quietly reshaped the narrative. The glass facade reflected her simplest self, the faded thrift store jacket she loved, worn jeans turned soft from years of wear, and the familiar canvas tote hanging at her side. She noticed a colorful banner stretched above the entrance announcing the newly launched Community Access Program, promising sliding scale fees, free workshops, and scholarships to those from underserved neighborhoods. Julia paused, a faint, knowing smile curving her lips. The sign was a silent victory. It symbolized change made real and tangible. She didn't need to step inside today. Her journey wasn't about the studio but about the doors it had helped open for many who once felt excluded. Turning away, Julia made her way through the bustling streets with a quiet confidence. At her old apartment, she settled into the modest kitchen where soft sunlight filtered through lace curtains. The small table, once bare, now held a simple pottery wheel, a gift from Anne, the art supply shop owner who had become a steadfast friend. It was Julia's own space, untethered from the judgments of others, a place where she could shape clay into something meaningful at her own pace. As she sat down, Julia's phone buzzed on the counter. A message lit up the screen, a note from a City Arts Foundation thanking her for her role in sparking community conversations around inclusivity. They invited her to speak as a guest at their upcoming event focused on accessibility in the arts. The invitation felt both humbling and affirming, and Julia tapped a quiet reply expressing gratitude and acceptance. A soft knock came at the door. It was Anne, carrying a small package of fresh clay and a few tools for sculpting. Their smiles were warm and familiar, a comfort in the fragile quiet of everyday life. "Thought you might like some new materials," Anne said, setting the package down. "I've been thinking, maybe we can run a workshop together sometime. Bring art to more corners of the city where it's needed." Julia's eyes brightened. The idea of collaboration, of reaching beyond herself, stirred her. "I'd like that," she said simply. Later that afternoon, Julia walked through the neighborhood where she worked. The familiar sights, the bakery filling the air with yeast and sugar, children laughing in a nearby park, shopkeepers arranging goods on the sidewalks, felt layered with new colors. People greeted her with nods and smiles, small acknowledgments that felt like quiet tributes to the courage she had shown. At work, Julia's duties remained as before, mopping restless floors, emptying bins, tending to the overlooked details that keep safe spaces running. But she carried herself differently now, with a quiet pride that echoed through her movements. It wasn't about changing the world overnight, she told herself. It was about staking a claim on one's own dignity, no matter the uniform or the role. One evening, she glanced at a message from clay and canvas. The studio had sent a carefully written letter of apology, acknowledging the hurt caused by their staff members' behavior and pledging ongoing efforts toward inclusivity and respect. Julia considered her response for a moment, then chose grace over grievance, a simple, measured reply thanking them for their willingness to improve. She knew that some things couldn't be undone by words alone, but recognition was a beginning. Some days were still hard, memories of that cold dismissal lingered like shadows, but the light of new connections and possibilities was steadily growing. On weekends, Julia began pushing the pottery wheel. Her hands, roughened by years of work, now moved with an unexpected gentleness across the pliable clay. Shapes rose beneath her fingertips, simple vessels, imperfect but alive. The process healed something inside her, a blending of strength and vulnerability. At community gatherings, Julia shared her story sparingly but meaningfully. Her voice, once timid, had grown steady and clear. She listened closely to others' experiences, their dreams and setbacks, and found in their stories the shared rhythms of resilience. One evening, as she sat with friends in a small cafe, laughter and music filling the cozy space, Julia felt an unfamiliar ease. The weight she had carried for so long was lifting. She realized she no longer sought permission to belong. Instead, she had carved out a place for herself through courage and quiet acts of defiance. Looking around at the faces glowing in the warm light, Julia took a slow sip of her tea and smiled softly. She understood now that status was not measured by fancy clothes, prestigious classes, or polished surfaces, but by the strength of one's heart and the bravery of standing tall, even when the world whispered otherwise. Her story wasn't a fairy tale of overnight triumph. It was smaller, truer, a janitor who found her own voice, challenged exclusion, and helped open doors for others. In the end,